The bidding war for Mynaric has begun. As German courts defend sovereign capability, Rheinmetall prepares their counter. Rocket Lab's advance on Mynaric began in 2025, and the concerned parties have entrenched their positions well. A $75 million U.S. cash and stock offer with an additional $75 million potential earnout was the opening salvo. We'll have to watch closely to see where things lie once the smoke clears.
NASA managed to solve Artemis 2's helium leak. Or was it a hydrogen leak? Well, either way, just to be safe, we have both. Artemis 2 is heading back to the vehicle assembly building to try to patch up the helium leak and prepare for a further delayed launch as soon as possible.
GEO's not back, we never even left. DIU announced a program sourcing commercially produced GEO assets for orbital asset observation purposes. With a 2-year timeline to MVP and a 4-year timeline to full demonstration, the DIU is focused on, quote, new GEO with a mandate to provide novel capability at reduced cost compared to incumbent GEO.
Welcome to this week's episode of Space Times Podcast. As always, I'm Harrison Lambert.
Here with Paul Mayer.
Excited to share this week's space industry updates with you. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Subscribe to our newsletter if you want the written breakdown of our episodes emailed to your inbox every Monday morning. Drop us a comment on our LinkedIn or Blue Sky with anything you enjoyed or would like to see. And as always, listen weekly on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're receiving this signal. This week, our main topics include Earth observation, government, and rockets. To start things off, there's quite a bit of news in the Earth observation market. Leading the charge is BlackSky, securing another 8-figure international contract to deliver data from their Gen 3 Earth imaging platform. This is another indication of sovereign space-based intelligence that is being demanded out of Europe. They've landed a number of 7- and 8-figure contracts throughout Europe over the past month. I think that counts up to like 5 or 6. So really impressive proving of their Gen 3 satellite. This is a high resolution sub 30 centimeter satellite capable of doing images of the Earth that you can see like a license plate. So there's very few satellites that are able to do this. There's BlackSky's Gen 3. There's Vantor's Worldview Legion. There is Planet's Pelican. And so far, given all these contracts, it seems like BlackSky is kind of leading the way with high resolution imaging. So congratulations to them on another huge contract.
Yeah, they're doing very well.
Kind of on the flip side of that, as I mentioned, Vantor is another company that has high-resolution Earth imaging satellites with their Worldview Legion spacecraft. But I've yet to see any real mentions of that spacecraft since they launched it and proved that it was actually taking pictures. Their approach is slightly different. They're integrating Google's world-class Earth AI imagery into their TensorGlobe product. So TensorGlobe is a global data set that is able to be integrated into AI models. It's a secure product, so they're able to sell it to government entities, and they feed it with data from their Earth imaging satellites. But they include Earth imagery from other satellites as well. So this is a big step forward for that product by including Google's Earth imaging, especially their AI imagery. It should add a lot of value to it, especially since Google's AI is one of the most advanced out there. So it adds extra value to this product that they're kind of growing. They've been growing over the past year or so.
Yeah. So Vantor is the data and imaging and data breakout from what used to be Maxar Technologies with Lanteris Space Systems, now purchased by Intuitive Machines, but Lanteris Space Systems being more of the manufacturing and hardware side of things. And so it's interesting to see Vantor, who still owns assets on orbit. They still own orbital image gathering, data gathering assets, to see them effectively outsourcing the data sets and the data inputs themselves.
Yeah.
It's the realization of a pretty sizable change in their business model that they've been executing towards.
Yeah, this is basically Digital Globe reimagined. I mean, when we were there, Maxar was a joint venture between SSL and MDA Space and Digital Globe. And Digital Globe was always the digital first kind of aspect to this. And, it proved that that was what was making most of the money, as we're kind of seeing with current trends where insights from space drive data has been the main driver of value across the customer base. So it seems like Vantor is really doubling down on this. When we were there, they bought quite a few companies that specialized in this, kind of ahead of the wave of current purchases, with Radiant Solutions, Rycon, Wovenware, and that has all fed into some of these products that they have. We've mentioned a few other really revolutionary data products that they have, but TensorGlobe seems to be one of their core offerings. And so this should build that out very nicely at a time where the demand for it can be higher.
Absolutely.
So TensorGlobe, it's a Earth imaging AI kind of melded products offering, but the AI is applied on the ground. So you can have higher throughput and you do more operations on more data. But the trend that we're seeing more recently is that deploying AI to space lessens the data load that has to be brought down to Earth, and you actually generate more value out of the insights generated from the data than having to generate value from all this extra data that costs money to downlink and store and process and all of that. So this week, Aspia Space selected Stellia, an applied AI platform company, as their strategic technology partner to advance architecture underpinnings of its Earth observation-derived data products. So this is a trend that we're seeing pick up across a number of companies. Again, Planet's one of them. I believe with their Tanager or their SuperDove platforms, they integrate AI into the onboard processing. I work at Loft Orbital doing this kind of stuff with their constellation of Earth observation satellites. So AI is playing a growing role in space applications. Like I said, reducing the amount of data that has to be brought down, improving insights. Another thing is latency. It's a concern with a lot of Earth observation is getting a ground station, especially with these low Earth observation satellites. It takes time, but if you're able to execute off of AI-derived insights on board, the turnaround on taking follow-up activities is a lot faster. So we're seeing a lot of demand for this across pretty much every Earth observation company, and I expect to see this becoming a much more prominent aspect of all Earth observation satellite businesses.
Yeah, one of the things that we saw from the investing side was a very similar trend, a very similar need to effectively solve the latency problem. And there's a lot of links in that chain that need to be solved. But the one of the biggest links that could be solved was just the sheer amount of data that needs to go down. So, when looking through and evaluating this market, one of the big sort of questions was, okay, is this something that folks are going to try and build themselves, or is this something that folks are going to try and buy elsewhere? And we've seen a fairly healthy distribution of that. It hasn't been overwhelmingly, oh, everybody's just going to build this capability themselves. Everybody's just going to do this themselves. And there's no room for any startups to specialize or win out in this. But simultaneously, there have been a lot of people who have decided, we'll just, we'll throw some sharp people on this. We'll throw some smart engineers on this, and they'll be able to solve this and figure this out, which has been interesting to see play out. There's been, I think, a healthy diversity and distribution of that, meaning that the industry as a whole is adopting this really rapidly. The industry as a whole is adopting AI processing and AI edge compute at a faster rate than one would have expected. And I would argue that a big part of that is that both space and AI themselves, both of these industries, new space and artificial intelligence, have been growing and maturing pretty darn rapidly. So it's been easy enough for them to effectively sort of grow and mature together at the same time. I would think that some of the bigger incumbents who are, your Lockheed Martin, your Northrop Grumman, your Boeing, the folks who have been doing this, your Airbus, the folks who have been doing this for 100 years, for 1,000 years, I would imagine that those folks are simply not able to adapt and move and be as nimble as necessary to try and build this capability in-house. And that's sort of what we're seeing. Some of the bigger folks who are a little bit clunkier and are a little bit less adept and nimble are the ones who have largely been doing these partnerships and throwing money at the problem to buy capability.
Yeah, I mean, Vantor is kind of a good example of that, where they insourced a lot of their AI, and they have very particular kind of business case that makes the most of the money, which is government insights and ISR capabilities. I know a couple of weeks ago we talked about Tomorrow.io integrating AI into their system, and it makes sense when the company's a pure play. For Tomorrow, it's weather data. So if they build their own AI, it's really useful for weather data. It's not something you'd want to share around. So it doesn't make sense to kind of separate out those companies. But, last week when we talked about compression, the compression company getting funding to develop like a cloud sensing, water sensing capability, that makes more sense as a independent AI technology that can be deployed to any satellite, as it's kind of an AI that would benefit any company that's doing Earth observation to reduce their data load at that stage, just removing parts of the image that aren't insightful or useful, even before they feed into other AIs that could generate data on board. So very interesting diversity of applications for AI. It's a growing trend in space for sure. On the other side of Earth observation, there's a growing trend of infrared, thermal infrared imaging and synthetic aperture radar, which has been playing out over a longer period of time. But Leonardo, which is a large Italian space defense company that's been in quite a few consortiums we mentioned recently, they're pushing heavily for space sovereignty in Europe, has announced that they're funding their own development of an Earth observation constellation. So this Earth observation constellation is primarily for missile detection, which are large, expensive constellations that have been primarily developed by the US, but we're seeing a growing demand for them in the EU with company partnerships like Rheinmetall and ICEYE doing synthetic aperture radar, Loft and Techiver doing synthetic aperture radar. Looks like Leonardo is kind of putting their own money behind their own play for this and developing synthetic aperture radar and thermal infrared imaging capabilities for missile detection. It's a bit different in that they don't really necessarily need to partner with anyone. They're great at the payload side of things. So most of these partnerships we've seen have been with companies that have figured out the synthetic aperture radar payload, but need a satellite provider to kind of integrate with them. This is kind of the case with Leonardo. They're best at this thermal infrared technology. They're a little more new at synthetic aperture radar, but given their background, it's something that I'm sure they'll be able to figure out. They have flown their own satellites before, so it's possible that they could build them themselves. But given their partnerships with Thales Alenia and Airbus, I would expect this to play out more like a consortium play to build some of these large defense prime satellites for European sovereignty. So strong signal from Leonardo that they see a demand for this, and that putting their own money behind it means that they expect that the government will jump on more funding to deploy a full constellation of Europe's sovereign missile detection capability.
Yeah. Do you remember top of mind whether the IR component was long wave, mid wave, or short wave?
I believe it's mid wave infrared.
Okay. Yeah. That's another one of the trends that we've seen this week and also this year, is that Europe has a multitude of different companies that are all playing in the mid wave and long wave thermal infrared imaging space, and there is clearly a shared belief that this asset class, that this wavelength class, is something that's going to be really valuable for defense and national security purposes. And there's a lot of money and a lot of investment going into this space, fully believing there to be a strong government and defense demand on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about Constellar last week when they got their funding round, and they kind of released a report along with that funding explaining what they had already accomplished. And I found it really impressive that, they talked about being able to track submarines given their the thermal tracks they leave behind in the water. They could track it for up to 60 minutes after the submarine had passed, which kind of removes the problems of using low Earth orbit observation satellites, and drives real value out of it. I mean, traditionally for missile detection, they're looking for like smoke or like flame detection of a rocket taking off. So if they pick up a submarine underwater, I'm sure they're just fine doing it for a missile.
Yeah, I can't imagine how much shorter the hunt for Red October would be if Constellar was up and running back in the day. But absolutely, there's a lot of really valuable information that can be gleaned for defense purposes.
So we're expecting Sean Connery to jump on as an investor for Leonardo's missile detection platform. It'll be interesting to see what Leonardo accomplishes, given that they're a large prime. They should have the technology to compete with the state of the art, which has increased drastically just given these past 2 weeks. Funding for some of these upstart companies are claiming that they can accomplish 3.5 meter resolution for thermal infrared, which is really high. In the past, 100 meters has kind of been the state of the art for large kind of government run satellites. But we're seeing that drop drastically. 3 meters is pretty good if you're just kind of getting a broad area and you can resample against multispectral imagery. And the highest that I've seen claimed is Super Sharp's Hibiscus thermal infrared imager that's supposed to be launching next year. They're able to get down to 3 meters. So not just a lot of funding going into this kind of area, but also a lot of improvement coming out of it as well. Another synthetic aperture radar move this week has been by a Japanese synthetic aperture radar company, Synspective. They're expanding to Europe with a new entity in Munich, which again is an indication that Europe is showing strong demand for this capability, which no surprise, we talk about ISI constantly. And it's kind of funny that ISI expanded to Japan and now Japan's expanding into ISI's territory. So there seems to be kind of a battle between the two companies to see who can claim the most between those two areas, which seem to have higher demand than elsewhere for synthetic aperture radar. But this is off the back of Synspective getting a large contract from the Japanese defense agency about a month ago. So it looks like they're taking that money and expanding rapidly into an arena that's demanding this kind of capability. We'll see how they're able to compete, because Europe's been very clear that they want sovereign capability over this technology. So I don't know how a Japanese company will necessarily be able to compete there. I think they're a bit more favorable than if like an American synthetic aperture radar company expanded there, but I wouldn't be surprised if they face strong headwinds trying to expand into Europe.
Yeah, they're going to have some difficulties passing the sovereignty test, to be sure. But in aggregate, I would think that this is still a net positive for Europe's SAR needs and capabilities, even if Synspective winds up having a completely commoditized product line. It is still very valuable to have that additional capability and that additional capacity, so that should, for whatever reason, one or the other of the current incumbents experience difficulties, there's not a single point of failure in the market. So even if there is some headwinds because they are a Japanese-based company, there's still room to be optimistic that things will that they'll still get some share of the pie there. ISI hasn't won everything yet.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if some sort of partnership deal comes out with Synspective and another European prime manufacturer. I mean, we had Astroscale partnering with European companies a couple of weeks ago to do space defense. So it's not unheard of for Japan to get contracts in what would be expected to be a very space sovereign focused kind of sector of the industry. So I wouldn't write this off. I'm sure they did their research and there's some demand there. And there's certainly, like we mentioned with Leonardo, looking to get into this kind of arena. There's other companies as well, like Safran. There's rumors going around that Safran's looking to acquire SatIM, who's a Latvian synthetic aperture radar. Sat team. Yeah. Your Latvian's much better than mine. I'll take your word on that. The rumors are kind of mixed of whether they would actually go for it. It sounds like the technology is not quite as mature as some other offerings. So I wouldn't be surprised to see if Synspective kind of gets into this role where they could partner with somebody like Safran and maybe one of the other companies like Thales or Airbus, who hasn't yet announced their synthetic aperture radar. I suppose Airbus is kind of already doing it through Loft with their partnership with TechConverse, since Loft uses Airbus platforms. But I wouldn't be surprised if Synspective partners with something like Thales for doing this, or maybe OHB. On the American side of the pond, there's also demand for missile tracking satellites. It's been ongoing for years now. It's one of the big government contract mechanisms for a space company. Northrop Grumman's kind of been the dominant player in this space, getting most of this SDA contracts. Although PWSA has been shaking that up with all their tranches going out to pretty much everybody but Northrop. So it wasn't surprising the news this week that Boeing is building a new facility. Looks like they're spending about $10 million to expand the facility to support Millennium's backlog of missile tracking satellites.
Switching over to the government side of things, the big news that we led the show with is that Rheinmetall is weighing a counterbid for Mynaric as their acquisition via New Zealand-based Rocket Lab is still sort of held up in German courts. So the acquisition wouldn't prove particularly compelling for current investors in Mynaric. Mynaric has been underperforming a little bit. They've had a rough couple of years. However, the big sort of hurdle to overcome is the sovereignty test. So regardless sort of the official reasoning and the official back and forth, regardless what winds up being described on paper as what held up this acquisition or what prevented this acquisition potentially. So regardless what winds up being the official reasoning for the delay, for the review, and should Mynaric's acquisition by New Zealand wind up being rejected, the clear sort of impetus for this is the sovereignty test. So the goal is undoubtedly to have Mynaric's IP, assets, and capabilities stay sovereign within Germany, and being owned foreignly represents a risk to that. So there could be a multitude of different ways in which an equal or comparable offer from Rheinmetall winds up getting approval and being approved and moving through, and that winds up winning. For whatever sort of legal compliance purposes, that offer may need to exceed the incumbent one and may need to actually beat Rocket Lab's offer. But we'll sort of see how that all plays out. But at the end of the day, this is an offer that has basically been in the books for about a year at this point, and it's being held up just to see if there's a way to legally keep everything local to Germany.
Yeah, and Germany basically pushed back. They said they would make the decision like a month ago, and they literally pushed back the decision. So I think they're exploring other options to acquire Mynaric to keep that sovereignty, which Rheinmetall seems to be the leader in. I'm surprised that OHB isn't kind of in the mix there, but given how much Rheinmetall's been spending on space capabilities, it's not very surprising. And they're a large defense contractor in Germany, so they've got money to spend.
They've also won a lot of the recent German and European defense contracts, so they are flush.
Yeah, and given this talk about space sovereignty for Europe for missile tracking, like optical terminals is one of the key technologies there. I mean, we talked about last week how the PWSA is enforcing that every satellite needs it. So this is. We've been saying this for months now. Like, I would not be surprised at all that Germany just outright blocks this, given Mynaric's like the only player in optical terminals in Germany. There's new companies every day coming out with their own optical terminals, but Mynaric's pretty far ahead. As you mentioned, like they've been struggling for years. So is the whole optical terminal industry in general. Like they're basically years early. Mynaric got acquired, getting acquired. Skylink got acquired last year by. Was it IonQ? And then Bridgecom was acquired by Voyager. So basically all the incumbents are out, and now what's happening is new ones are popping up. But Mynaric is built, it's ready. York Space is using it. Rocket Lab is using it. Like Germany wants to keep it for themselves. Rocket Lab really wants to buy it so they can get money off of all their competitors and the PWSA contracts. Like, this is a real interesting fight playing out over this one company that I'm sure they're enjoying the battle being wanted so badly.
Yeah, it's I wouldn't necessarily call it a proxy war, but there's the fight, quote unquote, the war over Mynaric is about much more than just Mynaric. To your point, there's a lot more at stake here than just that. Back stateside, the NASA Starliner investigation has officially declared that NASA, I believe, had a Series A or A-class failure in Type A failure in how they handled the Starliner program. It's the most serious level of mishap. So they've cited the agency's leadership as the primary cause of the difficulty, with some shortfalls in how it was managed and overseen. Honestly, sort of candidly, my personal opinion on the issue is that this feels a little bit like playing politics, that this is more about sort of trying to, I'll say, get a fresh or clean slate for the new NASA administrator and the new NASA administration, rather than it is accurately attributing blame to the previous NASA administration. The report didn't indemnify or exonerate Boeing in any capacity. And Boeing has had a series of engineering and quality control and execution challenges over the past several years. So personally, I still sort of feel like a lot of the responsibility probably lies with Boeing as to Starliner's difficulties and Starliner's shortfalls. But this report is very much trying to issue NASA's current status of or players of any sort of culpability in the issue.
Yeah, it's not surprising at all that they gave it the highest rating of failure. Type A is really bad. Like, it basically means that something really bad could have happened, which it did. I mean, all the reports they showed of Starliner is basically they got really lucky with the failure. It was a helium leak, which means that the pressure for the fuel was having problems, and they actually lost control of the Starliner while their astronauts were still on board. And it managed to recover by luck. Like, there was a system restart that managed to get the thrusters back long enough for them to dock with the ISS. But, as we reported months ago, they had to, well, actually, I guess we reported after the fact, they had to bring the Starliner back without the astronauts, and they were stranded on there for 6 months. So all around, it was a huge debacle. And NASA wasn't taking any of the blame. It was all on Boeing. But since then, the administration's changed to Isaacman. And so I think they're taking some of the heat. I agree with you. It seems very political. It gives Boeing a little bit of leeway to kind of work on Starliner. And I don't think they're giving up on Starliner. They need a second space shuttle for their astronauts. So it'll be interesting to see if they're able to recover from this. They've assigned 4 different groups to basically redo everything, make sure everything's up to spec before they ever try to fly Starliner again. We'll see if this new administration is able to do it better.
Additionally, the Defense Innovation Unit is sourcing commercially built geospatial spy satellites, geostationary spy satellites. So these satellites are intended to observe other satellites. They're not Earth observation. They are satellite to satellite observation. So they're focused on observing and analyzing both friendly and adversarial assets. These are intended to be defensive in nature. And so the program that they're standing up, the contracts that they're offering, it's a 2-year road to MVP, 4-year road to a demo. They want to see that the satellites are able to survive a 3-year minimum lifespan. And the contract potential seems to have about a 10-year rating for that. There's a couple of other deliverables. They want, 30-day revisit rates, standard throughout the SDA and throughout the geospatial industry. But the fact that they're observing other assets in orbit means that, if they're in a geostationary orbit, it's more dependent on the assets that they're observing and what that orbit time period is for them. But nonetheless, this is a really clear signal and a really strong indicator that the geostationary and the geo asset class is still very valuable. The program, the DIU specifically calls out that the purpose of this is to provide geostationary capabilities at a reduced, but really what it means is at a meaningful price point. Currently, I believe the price point is for most new geo companies is about 40% that of the traditional incumbents. So it'll be great to see the geo asset class continuing to grow and innovate and develop.
Yeah, I'd expect to see some capabilities that are already sort of developed just going for this contract. So when you talked about Bantor, they have a really impressive capability with their satellites to image other satellites. Whether they launch their own geo to pursue this contract, it's will be interesting to see. The other contract that comes to mind is the Blue Ring contract, which is Blue Origin's play at space domain awareness. They're launching a few different imagers on board of that mission, including their own Caracol imager, as well as Scout Space's imager. That is going out to GEO and is meant to basically do this. So I would not be surprised at all to see Blue Origin be one of the leading contractors for this DIU request. There's lots of companies that can pursue it. GEO is not a region that a lot of them play in currently, but with the right partnership, I could see them going out there. This demand is pretty fast turnaround, but given the pressure that U.S. has been facing in GEO over the past year from China and Russia, it's very clear that this is a quickly growing demand on space technology. We had all those RPO demos from China in GEO last year with the Xi'an, Xinjiang spacecrafts that were showing refueling and maneuverability in GEO. There is the Luch Olymp satellites that are getting close-up inspections of adversarial satellites from Russia. There is the Mosaic satellite that's doing stealth technology. So, they're trying to build quickly out not just the capability to observe adversarial satellites in GEO, but also protect against them. So this is kind of in line with some of the other trends we're seeing with companies like Lodestar and Fracastra defending against other spacecraft. And it'll be interesting to see how this technology has to advance to account for these stealth satellites like the Mosaics that are intentionally trying to hide from detection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing that really sticks out and jumps out to me about this is that your standard incumbent geostationary satellite has an operating life of 15 to 30 years. It's just up there and around for generations. And these are specifically calling out a 3-year operating life expectancy, which is more in line with LEO assets, which sort of gives me the impression that they are trying to effectively, like you were describing, repurpose existing capabilities and existing assets for this new use case. So they're expecting more LEO birds, more LEO assets to be repurposed for a geostationary altitude, to be focused at a different mission type, rather than new or incumbent GEO players transitioning from Earth observation or telecommunication to satellite observation. So I think you're right to sort of point to some of the LEO players like Scout Space and others who are likely going to be able to adapt their technology, sort of an Armageddon situation, if you will. We're going to train oil rig operators to be astronauts rather than train astronauts to operate the oil rig. But you get the point, joking aside.
Yeah, no, I expect to see Halliburton bidding on these contracts very soon. The other one would be interesting. It would be like Think Orbital with their X-ray satellite. I could see them bidding on this. It would be an interesting application for a very new technology.
It's some fun stuff for sure. A little bit further north, MDA Space has officially launched 49 North to capture some Canadian defense contracts. So 49 North is officially a subsidiary. It's a whole subsidiary for MDA focused entirely on defense. And this is largely in line with what we've seen. Canada has benefited largely from some of the geopolitical dynamics over the past several years, and they've wound up growing some stronger and closer relationships with European defense efforts and with European agencies and national defense priorities. And as a result, MDA has effectively been trying to stand up their own explicit defense arm. They've been hiring internationally. They've been hiring domestically. They've been hiring extensively to stand up the engineering and contract bidding capacity and capability necessary to bid at and win a large swath of Canada's increased defense spending, and also partnerships with European defense spending. So this is a pattern and a trend that has been in the making for the past several years that MDA is pursuing wholeheartedly.
Yeah, and I think they're in a good position to pursue these defense contracts. I mean, they're one of the largest Canadian space companies out there, and they have technology that we're seeing demand for in Europe. So I think this really jumpstarts Canada's capability to stay up to speed with other regions. MDA Space has the radar satellites. They're very experienced with synthetic aperture radar. They have the Canada arm on board the ISS, so they've got a breadth of robotics knowledge, probably more advanced than pretty much any company anywhere. And these are both technologies that are actively being developed for space defense capabilities. So they have a huge head start. I'm sure this helps them capture these defense contracts that they could easily win. So expecting to see more growth out of MDA Space very soon.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think MDA Space learned a lot from the last time they tried to branch out and build out into defense contracting. And I think they're very well positioned for success.
Yeah. You think they'll reacquire Luminar?
Back across the pond, InnoFlight signed a launch service distribution agreement with UK-based space consultancy and launch brokerage firm Commercial Space Technologies Limited to strengthen its presence in the European market.
Yeah, this is a trend that is kind of popping up again. Space Launch signed a contract very similar to this to launch a Brazilian satellite for Avio about a month ago. Traditionally, this market hasn't been great. And I think the reason was that there weren't a lot of rocket launchers out there. So the ones that were able to handle, the launches themselves. But with the growth of the space market and growing diversity of launchers, I think having this sort of middleman to broker the right rocket for the right launches is becoming a growing need again. I haven't heard too much about Commercial Space Technologies, but it makes sense that UK would have launch brokers, seeing as how they don't really have their own launcher just after Orbex went out of business last week. So this should help bridge some of their capability to get their technology stood up.
Additionally, Kepler Communications has chosen Kongsberg Nano Avionics, a leading small satellite manufacturer and mission integrator, as the preferred European satellite bus provider for its hosted payload initiatives aboard spacecraft up to about 500 kilograms in mass.
Yeah, this one's a bit odd because Kepler builds their own buses. So partnering with somebody to build buses seems very much like a play to be able to win contracts in Europe, especially given their emphasis on space sovereignty. I think this gets them that aspect of their satellite. Last month, we talked about them launching Aurora Tech on board their Kepler satellites, the first batch of Kepler satellites. So that's a German space company, which points to the fact that they're getting interest from European space companies. And they're making a push in their sales materials for more payloads that want real-time communication of their data, which plays really nicely into the whole missile tracking business that we've been talking about. Kepler has optical terminals, not just to communicate between their satellites, but also to the ground, which they're the only ones that are doing it so far, which puts them way ahead of all competition like Starlink or Amazon Leo. So this kind of capability is something that I'm sure is in high demand, and being able to sell this to Europe would probably bring them in a lot of money following their first launch of Kepler satellites last month. So on the rocket side of things, we have some more drama with NASA. The Artemis 2 mission, which is aboard the SLS, Space Launch System, that was moved to the launch pad a month ago, is facing a new problem. They managed to fix a hydrogen leak they're having over the past month. But right as they're wrapping that up, they found a new leak of helium. So they are not having a fun time with ultralight gases. This helium leak looks like it's a bit more severe, as they're claiming they're finding plans to move the SLS back to the assembly building. They're claiming this will only delay them another month or so, but moving it back is not a great sign. And hopefully whatever they did to fix the hydrogen holds up well enough so that, once they do roll it back out, they don't face any other problems. As we talked about with Starliner, helium leak is not a fun problem to have. It happens a lot with spacecraft. I would have hoped they would not have this issue, but it pops up a lot. It's really hard to keep these gases constrained. So not a great sign for Artemis 2, but I'm sure they'll figure out a fix for it and be back to the pad in what they're saying late March. And we'll have our rocket off to the moon soon enough.
Well, that would be great if they were able to fix that. I mean, you'd think that if you can plug the hydrogen leak, that helium wouldn't be able to get out of it. But, what do I know?
I think there's slightly different systems. So I think the hydrogen is on the first stage, they're Hydrolox engines. And then the second stage uses the helium as pressurant, much like the Starliner did. So problem up and down the stack. And I was expressing concerns last week when when the Vulcan rocket had a burn through on their solid booster, because the solid boosters on the SLS are also manufactured by Northrop Grumman. So hopefully the whole rocket doesn't have issues. They've actually identified both problems. And, I'm sure they can fix a helium leak. My main concern is that they find another problem after that, and it's just one after another. Yeah, hopefully it's not the same NASA team that was reviewing Starliner that's handling the helium leak on SOS. So they already fixed that much. For a company we haven't heard a lot from recently is Stratolaunch. They have the Rock aircraft that launches rockets from the air. There's not very many companies that do this. It's like Pegasus out of Northrop Grumman. We talked about starfighters a few months ago going public, although I don't think they've launched anything yet.
There's not many companies doing this anymore.
Yeah. Well, Pegasus is going to launch Catalyst soon, so they're not done, but there's very few launches from that platform. I think Virgin Orbital was the one that went out of business because there's just not a lot of money in this. And, Stratolaunch has been struggling for years. They're basically being propped up out of altruism for the late Paul Allen, who founded the company and passed a few years ago, but his family's keeping it going. And it looks like they're sort of pivoting towards the hypersonics testbeds area of things with the Mach TB 2.0 awarded to them. The Department of War's Test Resource Management Center is awarding them a contract to NWSC Crane's SMART OTA vehicle. And this is, of course, to expand their hypersonics testbed. This is kind of a growing demand we're seeing across launch providers. I think it's driven mainly by the increase in demand for missile capabilities, both just in terms of generating missiles for ongoing wars around the world, as well as developing hypersonic missile technology. We've seen it in Europe with hyperspace. We've seen it in America with several companies like Ursa Major. And now we're seeing, well, not now, Stratolaunch has been working on it for at least a year, but they are continuing to work on it as a new kind of business sector that they can make money off of. In kind of that same vein of things, Anduril Industries announced that they've received $43.7 million in Defense Production Act Title III funding to expand their solid rocket motor production in the U.S. The Anduril has said that this is to increase efficiency and resiliency of their factory and expand test fire infrastructure for more complex motors, increasing storage capacity and acquiring common production tooling in manufacturing level quantities. So this is another trend kind of in the same vein as hypersonics testing. But solid rocket motors have had a huge boost in production over the past year. We've talked about it a lot with Avio. They're getting and spending hundreds of millions of dollars to produce rockets, both in Europe for the war in Ukraine, as well as expanding into the U.S. with a $500 million investment in their production here in order to support Lockheed Martin primarily and RTX in missile production around the globe. There's other companies playing in the space like Ursa Major. It's another, they're doing hypersonics and this sort of thing. Expo is another one. Looks like Anduril is starting to come into this sort of market as well. It's growing demand across the industry for solid rockets. Back in Europe, Satell IoT and PLD Space has signed a commercial contract for a dedicated mission. They're going to launch 2 high-capacity Trito satellites on the Mira 5 vehicle in 2027. This will be the first launch for the Mira 5 for PLD Space, which is great that they're able to sign some contracts for it. It is impressive that it's a dedicated mission, but Satell IoT has done a lot of development. They're trying to get their satellites up there for a 5G direct-to-device network. If this goes off without a hitch, this will be a great capability for Spain as they're able to launch their own constellation using their own rockets. This would be a boon for Europe in terms of getting constellations up to compete with Starlink. So here's hoping that PLD Space is able to launch successfully in 2027.
So a handful of really interesting business updates this week to talk about. We've already sort of alluded to this, but SatView just closed a £30 million funding round, bringing their total equity raise to about £60 million. SatView is a thermal infrared imager, and they're one of the ones who are able to hit 3.5 meter resolution. And we sort of alluded to this earlier, but this is, again, further evidence and proof of the medium and long wave infrared imaging being a asset class of priority and value for European nations. There's a lot of different players that are working on this. They are all European based. SatView, Constellar, SuperSharp, all of these are European nations. SuperSharp is the one with the 3-meter resolution going up in 2027. And we've spoken about some of the capabilities there. But I would very much expect to see the US at some point prioritize TIR and focus on catching up and standing up their own capabilities, whether that's going to be by trying to effectively buy that capability like a Lockheed or a Northrop, buying and integrating and just Hoover vacuuming up one of these other startups, or whether that's going to be more of a DIU and a ground up play with government spending and government funding prioritizing that asset class. That remains to be seen. I think the fact that Rocket Lab is not able to purchase or has not been able to purchase Mynaric is a pretty good indicator that a US-based prime would have a lot of difficulty getting approval to acquire and purchase what is currently sort of a bottlenecked capability that Europe holds the purse strings to. So I think it's much more likely that we'll see in the next sort of appropriations package or the next couple of appropriations packages, medium and long wave thermal infrared imaging start to really be a prioritized asset class for defense and for the U.S. government.
Yeah, the U.S. government's had some traction with it. It's mainly on the PWSA Tranche 1, I believe. Not every tranche of PWSA needs imagers. A lot of the layers are communication. But for obvious reasons, the government is very tight-lipped about where their thermal infrared imaging comes from. I believe Honeywell is one of the main producers of this capability, although I'm sure Lockheed and Northrop have their own internal capability as well. It's interesting that there aren't as many upstarts in the U.S. pursuing this capability, but it might just be that the U.S. primes have such a stranglehold on missile defense, historically at least, that there's not much demand for this capability here. I think with Europe and the US separating and Europe trying to stand up their own capabilities, there's kind of this opening for players there that there's not in the US. And even though Leonardo's already got this technology, I think that the speed at which they're trying to move and the opportunities in Europe are giving a better environment for startups to kind of pursue this technology. So I don't know if I would expect to see this in the US unless there's really like a higher resolution capability that can be achieved. But 3 meters is pretty good for thermal infrared.
Additionally, Swiss to 12 is considering an IPO next year, targeting roughly a $1.3 billion valuation. So this continues with the ongoing pattern of liquidity in space that we've seen off the back of York Space's liquidity, off the back of a couple of different SPACs. There is also the expected IPO for SpaceX. So we're seeing a lot of different companies reach market. We saw Firefly last year. So space is very much in a, we'll call it liquidity wave, and it's a great time to get liquid. That does not appear to be slowing down at all. So now is a great time to raise your last round of funding, and money's going to flow really easily. We'll see how long this wave lasts, but it's all good news for the investing and early stage operating communities for sure. In addition to these top level announcements, there's also a multitude of different raises that have occurred over the past week. Starting off with Agile Space. Agile Space Industries out of Colorado has raised a $17 million Series A to ensure that they can fulfill their orders without increasing their delivery times. Now, ASI creates chemical thrusters, mono and biprop thrusters. Lockheed Martin Ventures is one of the major investors on their table. And even though Lockheed Martin didn't explicitly lead this most recent round, 70% of the capital that went into this $17 million Series A came from the folks already on their cap tables. So Lockheed Martin Ventures is a corporate venture capital effort. It's a CVC. And typically CVCs aren't necessarily investing looking for an ROI. They're investing looking for capabilities. And so the fact that this raise was announced specifically as an effort to maintain their delivery times and was specifically mentioned as an effort to maintain capability and capacity, really sort of rings true that this is largely a corporate venture effort. Additionally, Integrate closed a $17 million Series A and landed a $25 million Space Force contract. Integrate does secure program management software, which is a pretty big challenge for the program management space, is both integrating and remaining compliant with the security and software, the info and software security needs for government and defense contracts. So great to see Integrate solving that layer of difficulty and challenges.
Yeah, and I think it's in direct response to the government trying to speed up their procurement process, allowing them to integrate program management across companies that haven't quite become compliant with defense protocols is going to be helpful in kind of growing new capabilities within the U.S.
Mesh Optical Technologies is finally out of stealth mode and has announced their $50 million Series A round, led by Thrive Capital, with participation from Also Capital, Banner VC, and Mantis Venture Capital. So Mesh Optical Technologies is a laser intersatellite link company founded by some SpaceX alums. And so a $50 million Series A to leave stealth is an absurdly, it's a very lucrative Series A raise for a company that has effectively not been selling themselves. But the fact that it's from a well-rounded and experienced team out of SpaceX means that they have a lot of reputation capital that they've earned from their time at SpaceX that they're able to leverage into this position.
Yeah, yeah, it comes at a time when a lot of new optical terminal companies are being stood up. So it'll be interesting to see what their differentiating capability is. But even without one, I think there's quite the fertile land for them to kind of land contracts. There's not a huge amount of ISO companies left over after all the acquisitions, so they should be able to compete in that space. And between the defense contracts and some of these commercial applications like Blue Origin's TerraWave or Kepler growing out their constellation, there's just a huge demand across the board for this capability, and it seems inevitable that every spacecraft is going to move towards implementing this capability, and especially with the standards that are being forced upon the industry from both the Space Defense Agency and even again with commercial applications like the Hokusai protocol out of Japan. This isn't like a winner take all kind of industry or sector anymore. So 50 million gives me a huge starting kind of advantage, and hopefully they can leverage that into taking out a piece of that sector for themselves.
Yeah, that's a pretty big war chest, and definitely more than enough capital for them to prove out the technology, get the technology functional, and then achieve some meaningful market shares of their beachhead and their second and tertiary desired markets as well. A lot they'll be able to do with that. Additionally, Terra Mastra has announced a $10 million seed capital raise to activate a sovereign ground-based infrastructure platform aimed at strengthening communications resilience and space safety across the Indo-Pacific. So the Australian defense startup is providing sovereign infrastructure to fill a sizable gap and need in Australia's security needs. If you'll recall, there was back in February of 2025 an alleged circumnavigation of Australia by a Chinese flotilla, largely without Australia's knowledge. So this is very much a step at solving that sort of problem and building out some of the infrastructure necessary to provide a more robust defense and security network for space assets on Australia's home turf. So great to see Terra Mastra getting some traction and getting some momentum there.
Yeah, and it's definitely a growing trend for Australia to stand up their own sovereign capabilities. Like every region, Australia is not not an exception. They spent a bunch of money on Gilmore space couple of weeks ago to stand up some rocket launch capability.
Yep.
The Kuniva test range has been getting a lot of use out of BARDA. I expect them to expand the usage of that as a launch base. This is just another sign that Australia is starting to take seriously space capabilities.
Absolutely. And finally, Seagate Space has announced their $1.5 million pre-seed raise.
Yeah, this is to develop their water-based or sea-based launch capabilities. We mentioned them a couple months ago when they announced a partnership with Biospace, who's another very early launch capability. It'll be interesting to see how soon they can get to actually launching something. We've tried this before with Sea Launch and it didn't go so hot, although they were able to launch a few times before they went out of business. So, there's a precedence for this kind of capability. And I think the demand for launch sites is high enough now that that's a tailwind for them, especially given that China's been seeing great success with their Yellow Sea marine platform. I think they'll put extra pressure on the U.S. to develop this capability this time around. In the tech advances, these are news things that don't fit into our main topics or other business views. We have Starcatcher signing a partnership with Apple Inc. To have their satellites be a customer to Starcatcher's space solar panel or space solar power satellites. So Starcatcher puts up satellites that generate solar power and then beam it to Earth. That's their primary use case, although they've been signing a growing backlog of customers to buy solar power for their satellites. So Apple Inc. is a telecommunications constellation company that we've been reporting on a lot recently. They've gotten a lot of great traction and money coming in to deploy their satellites, and they believe they just got approval to launch 4,000 satellites last week. So being able to have additional uptime for their satellite constellation by getting solar power from Starcatcher could be a huge benefit. Starcatcher has signed other contracts like with Loft Orbital to be a customer for their solar power. But seeing as how Apple Inc. is yet to deploy their satellites, it could be a benefit to the design of their spacecraft prior to launch. Frontier Space has partnered with Azenta Life Sciences to advance space-based life sciences research infrastructure. So this is on the back of Frontier Space having successfully done a mission with Azenta already. So this seems to be a strong signal that mission was successful, and they want to continue developing this partnership with Frontier Space to build out what they're claiming is their on-orbit kind of laboratory for developing life science technology. So they've got some key technology in terms of thermal management and the actual components used to place the materials for their pharmaceuticals. This is a great trend that we've been seeing recently. In-space manufacturing has kind of been something waiting in the wings for a while, but we're starting to see real traction, particularly with BARDA and them being on their fifth mission of launching materials to orbit, manufacturing orbit, returning to Earth. So it's great to see other players like Frontier Space getting some traction here as well, because it's a great value add to the space ecosystem. You're generating value on orbit and bringing it back to Earth, which is what we love to see. And lastly, for today, we have a paper that came out that was explaining the benefits of modulating retroreflectors to achieve low complexity optical intersatellite links for small spacecraft. So this I found to be a really interesting article because it's a novel application of optical laser terminals, which again is something that's been a growing trend. And as we mentioned a couple of times this week, has a lot of demand across the space industry. The technology they're describing here is particularly interesting because they're able to fit it onto small CubeSat sized payloads. They brought the power consumption down from average of 10 watts for most of these hardware down to 2.5 watts, which they're bringing the swap down size, weight, and power of the whole system to be able to use it on smaller spacecraft, which opens up a lot of opportunities for deploying smaller nodes for these kind of interconnected constellations. The technology itself uses modulation of the retroreflector to basically encode data into the reflected light from another optical terminal. So the satellite with an optical satellite link beams a laser to this device. It modulates its retroreflectors to switch up the data that's encoded in the laser and reflect it back to the terminal that sent the data over. And in that way, they're able to create a symmetrical link between the command and the control satellite.
That is a wrap of the week's recap of the space industry. Thank you so much for joining us. We certainly hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, please drop us a comment, check out our socials, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Until next time, this has been Paul Mayer and Harrison Lambert signing off for now.